And we are recording with, I think for the third time, maybe the fourth time, Mr. Ray McGovern, who's, like I just said, been on here a couple times before. This is episode 898 on Monday, September 5th, 2022 at 3:19 p.m. Eastern Time. Mr. McGovern, please introduce yourself before we delve into all things going on in the world.
Sure. I think what I would put forward as my main advantage is my longevity.
I'd say that, yeah.
I mean, there are certain advantages to this kind of hair, and I've been watching Russia, China, and actually the international affairs since I started majoring in these things as an undergraduate in 1958, if you can believe it. I majored in Russian. And then after my army service, I went on as an analyst of Russian affairs with the CIA. My job was to watch Russian foreign policy, Soviet foreign policy in those days, vis-a-vis China, Southeast Asia, Japan, and the international communist movement. So I had quite a portfolio. And even though my area expertise, I got a master's in area studies, was focused on Russia and the Soviet Union. By virtue of what I was ordered to do, I got a good education in international relations from the bottom up. And that's far better than taking a whole bunch of IR courses, I would submit. After I left the agency, I have to say, I suppose that my favorite job at the agency was briefing one-on-one the principal advisors in national security to Ronald Reagan, his vice president, George H.W. Bush, George Shultz, Secretary of State, Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense. Yeah, and a couple other folks, high muckety mucks, as my Irish grandmother would call them. Reagan himself, not so much. He preferred to sleep in. These were early morning briefings. He would consult with these same folks that I briefed at about 11:30 in the morning to tell them what was going on. Now, after I left the agency, it became clear to me that my former colleagues, I mean, it's hard to say, my former colleagues were manufacturing evidence to justify an unjustifiable war. I talk, of course, about Iraq. And this was a little bit too much for those who still had some integrity. And so we formed veteran intelligence professionals for sanity. We're publishing a memo now to President Biden today. But in those days, we set ourselves up before Iraq, and our first memo was to President Bush. We had to assume that he didn't know that the intelligence was being cooked. I'm distracted here. My wife is not well.
You're quite all right. I'll fill the gaps. Yeah. So, it's one thing I suppose we're going to get into a little bit today is the cooking of intelligence, or the perceived cooking of intelligence, or the unnoticed cooking of intelligence, and what it can lead to, the wars it can lead to, and how we often don't notice it till it's 20 plus years later, and by then you can't.
Okay, I'm back there, Tom. It's a false alarm. My wife, rather than calling for me, was on the phone, so that's a good sign.
Good, beautiful, wonderful.
So
the cooking of intelligence you were talking about.
This was just not done. I mean, people have to understand. Well, first of all, that there are two CIAs, right?
Mm-hmm.
The one that Truman set up to give him what he called untreated, unbiased, objective intelligence of what was going on in the world. And the other thing that was sort of foisted on him, the operations people who were really good at overthrowing governments and doing other things like that. Now, never the twain met. It was a structural fault from the outset. But there we were in the same building. We were separated by turnstiles, if you can believe it, on each of the 7 floors. The analysts couldn't go to where the operators were, and the operators couldn't go to the analysts without a special badge or something. Now, there were advantages in that, but the reason I mention it is that our job was to tell the truth. Now, you tell somebody in Washington that, right, yeah, right, you, you had no political agenda, huh? Tell me another one. You know what? We didn't. And particularly on the Soviet Union, yeah, I could write what I thought. And sometimes we ran into problems, but they were mostly problems overcome by gutsy leaders. So, in a word, Truman said, look, I want you to tell me like it is. I'm not going to put you under the State Department or under the Defense Department. I'm going to create my own national security apparatus, and you're going to report directly to me, and you have career protection for telling me the truth. All right. That sounds bizarre these days, but we had it. Okay. So it was really good duty. So imagine my surprise when Bush and Cheney came in, and the head of the rulers of the CIA, so to speak, decided that they would smell the prevailing winds and dovetail their conclusions to what Bush and Cheney wanted. And what they wanted was to prove that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Total falsification of the situation there. We knew that. Scott Ritter, one of our VIPs, was the chief Iraq inspector, and he verified that he personally could say that 95% of weapons of mass destruction had been destroyed under UN supervision, his supervision. Now, could he tell that to his senator? Her name was Mrs. Clinton from New York? No, she wouldn't let him in the door. Could he tell that to the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, headed by, what's this guy named? Oh, yeah, Joe Biden at the time. He wouldn't let Ritter in the door. So, you know what? This is a little vignette. You know what Scott did? He's a gutsy guy, right? He went to the UN and he got a copy. He got a copy of the debriefing report of Hussein Kamel, who was one of Saddam Hussein's sons-in-law. Okay. Now he defected in, when did he defect? It was about 2000 and I'll remember it in a second, about 2005 or 6, something like that. So they debriefed him, and they said, okay, now tell us about the weapons of mass destruction. And he said, they will have all been destroyed. And they said, well, wait a second. All destroyed? What do you mean are all destroyed? How do you know that? He said, well, have you not done your homework? I was in charge of those weapons. My father-in-law told me to get them destroyed, and I destroyed them. Oh, well, how did you verify that yourself? Hussein Kamel says, well, yeah, I picked a couple sites. I went to, are you trying to get me, what are you trying to get me to say? That there are still weapons of mass destruction? There aren't any. No chemical, biological, nuclear, no rockets. I saw them all destroyed. Now, the UN had that, the British had it, the CIA had it. Scott Ritter got a copy of it. It was not classified by any American organization. He gave it to Newsweek. Okay, now this is how bad it is. He gave it to Newsweek in February, mid-February of 2003, a good month before the invasion, the attack on Iraq. And Newsweek took this transcript and verified that it was authentic. And they said, oh, what we can do with this? Oh, we can't ignore it. And they put it in this little section. They used to have Periscope section, you know. Oh, by the way, we learned that blah, 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 blah. And of course, this caused quite a stir. And so a lot of the correspondents, a lot of the newspaper people went up to Langley to talk to the PR people at the CIA. And they said, what about this? My God, what about this? And this guy took out the drawer of all the expletives the leaders said, This is crap. This is no good. This is erroneous. This is crazy. And the newspaper people and the video people said, whew, wow, thanks for telling us, because we were going to write a story on this. Newsweek published that in their paper version on the 1st of March, 2003. As you remember, the invasion came on what, the 21st of March. So they had, 3 weeks to do their job. They were all caught up in justifying this war. They knew it was bogus. But what hurt us, of course, was that we saw our old colleagues, our former colleagues, those of us who had retired, as I had, deliberately to participating in this charade and making it possible for 1 million Iraqis no longer to be alive today. That was as bad as it got. So, long story short, we set up this Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity in January of 2003. Our first memo was when Colin Powell deceived the UN Security Council. That afternoon, we wrote to President Bush. We had to assume he didn't know how bad the intelligence was. So we said, look, what you need to do, and this is how we ended. We strongly advise you to broaden the circle of your advisors beyond those clearly bent on a war for which we see no cogent reason and from which we believe the unintended consequences are likely to be catastrophic, period, end quote. We take no joy in having been right about that. We are angry as hell that nobody paid any attention to it. So that's where we are now. We're talking about Ukraine. We're talking about China. We're talking about things that we know about. Having been right almost 20 years ago, we hope that people will give us the credulity that we think we merit. I mean, each of us had some 30, 35 years of experience in this government, national security affairs, whether it was State Department, CIA, the Army, wherever, NSA. So today we're writing it's interesting. I just have to sign off on the final draft. It's a memo to Biden, and he says, look, it says, you're sending Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin off to Ramstein so that he can meet with counterparts on Thursday and plan the next tranche of weapons and support for Ukraine. Okay, listen, you can't expect to get unvarnished intelligence from secretaries of state or secretaries of defense or army chiefs. Okay, and then we go through a long list from Vietnam to Iraq to Syria to Lloyd Austin himself, who was head of the Central Command for 3 years, during which in 2015, 51 analysts, military analysts, complained to the Pentagon Inspector General that the top of CENTCOM was censoring and distorting and making their analysis false by claiming that Al Qaeda and those other terrorists, no real problem. We got to beat. So Lloyd Austin, as we say, has a not unblemished record on this. So, Mr. Biden, you need to know, number one, Ukraine is not winning this war, okay? Don't believe the New York Times. Don't believe Secretary Austin if he tells you that. Truth is the first casualty of war, and defense secretaries have no immunity against this awful virus that makes them make the public arena part of the war. I mean, it happens all the time. I'm not sure Biden knows how bad it is right now, but that's how we see our job. We say, look, we've been around a while, we'll go back 20 years almost. This is what we think. Take it into consideration. You're not going to win. Your National Intelligence Director, a very bright woman named Avril Haines, has told you, Mr. Biden, that it's unlikely that Putin will have his back up against the wall in Ukraine. But if he did, that's not good news, Mr. Biden. That means that he might be tempted to use nuclear weapons. So, which way is it? So you want to weaken Putin to the point where he'll be tempted to do that because it's an existential threat to him as he sees it in Ukraine? Or you want to work something out, for God's sake, before tens of thousands of other Ukrainians die? We don't suggest policy as intelligence analysts, but when we lay out the facts in a factual way, the idiocy of some policies become very apparent. And actually, the path towards some sensible outcomes also should become apparent. And that's our job as veteran intelligence professionals, for sanity.
So, with all of your experience and seeing the patterns repeat themselves over the years and decades, and what you just said, you're not going to get untreated intelligence from a secretary who very much so wants to keep their job, and whether or not they're consciously doing it or subconsciously doing it are probably yes men. It's just what it is. Is this something that we're going to be looking back on in 20 years and saying it was all cooked? We shouldn't have gotten involved in Ukraine? Or is it going to be the opposite? Is it going to say, are we going to say we should have doubled down? We should have quadrupled down. We should have, we had no idea that China was going to invade Taiwan on September 6th. What are your thoughts on, not to put you on the record and not to say that you have a crystal ball, but kind of am doing that because who cares? What do you think about that?
Well, Tom, I think you've put your finger on the most important difference in the world today. And that is simply that the bipolar world that existed when the Soviet Union was up and running, and the unipolar world that existed when the Soviet Union fell apart and the US was the only really major superpower, is gone. They're both gone. Okay. What do we have now? Well, we have three main, really, really important countries with strategic potential, including nuclear weapons. They are the United States, Russia, and China. Now, by virtue of our policies over the last 2 decades, we have driven Russia and China together into what amounts to an alliance, okay? They describe it themselves as something exceeding a normal alliance, something that has, quote, no limits. Whoa.
They said that?
Yeah, no limits. They said that in a very comprehensive, well drawn out, well drafted statement on the 4th of February, issued while President Putin was in Beijing to help President Xi launch the Winter Olympics. So what does that mean? Well, you'll have troglodytes who will say, well, it's communist propaganda, then forget about it. Well, no, what it means is this, that when China or when Russia makes a big strategic decision, they don't do anything without checking with one another.
Mm.
This is big, okay? Now, just to give you I come from the Bronx, and we used to talk about, I'll give you a for instance, okay? I'll give you a for instance. Here's a for instance. At the turn of last year, Putin concluded that it was a fool's errand trying to get the West to take cognizance of Russian security concerns right in the center of Europe. So he also saw Ukrainian forces trained by the tens of thousands for the last 8 years in Western countries, up to NATO standards, ready to pounce on the Russian-speaking areas of Donetsk and Lugansk, the so-called Donbass area of Ukraine. We also saw that the people being shelled in those areas under the lead by the leaders of these from hard right nationalist sotto voce neo-Nazi battalions, which are there, that the Russian-speaking people had lost, people say 12 to 14,000 people since the coup in 2014. So he goes up to Beijing and he's launching the Olympics with President Xi. And he says, uh, President Xi, you call me your best friend, and I really like that. Well, I got to tell you something. The West has not taken me seriously. I think I may have to invade Ukraine. Now, I wasn't there, of course. My concept of how Xi Jinping reacted was, you mean after the Olympics are over, right? No. So the day after the Olympics are over, the Russians recognized Donetsk and Lugansk as independent countries. They in turn call for Russian help. 2 days later, there's the invasion of Ukraine. Now, there is a logical, fallacious way of arguing called post hoc ergo propter hoc. Just because, just because the Beijing Olympics ended on the 20th of February, that doesn't mean that Putin was waiting till the 24th to invade Ukraine. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that,
Sure.
but the timing is very interesting. So
Timing, yeah.
all I'm saying here is that, you know, if there's a real dust up out in the Taiwan Strait, let's say the next time U.S. warships want to go through there, the Chinese are even more restrictive. Last time, most people don't know this, but they made sure that the U.S. warships put the antennas down and make sure they weren't doing any intelligence stuff. Okay. Innocent passage means innocent passage, right? What will they do next time? Well, if there's a dust up there, I don't expect a war. I don't. China doesn't want a war over Taiwan. And I think there may be some crazies in Washington, but I think the military realize they don't like to lose. They keep losing. So I don't think there'll be a war, but there could be a dust up. What is Putin going to do? Well, you watch what he does in Ukraine. Just watch it. He'll do something that will remind Xi that Putin is his best friend after all. And what does that mean? That means, of course, the United States and NATO will face a two-front war, in many ways our own fault for challenging these people and putting them on the enemy list as number one and number two. First, we take care of Putin, and we turn toward this, what do they call it? This
Rising
innate
China.
enemy, yeah, in China. So that's the change in the what the old Soviets and the Marxists used to call the world correlation of forces. Just to show this sort of pictorially, here's an equilateral triangle, okay? Now, it used to be this way, Russia, China, US. Now it's sort of like an isosceles triangle with, guess who's on the short end? The US is on the short end. And the thing that's most worrisome, of course, is that the sophomores that are advising Biden, I think of Tony Blinken and what's that guy, Jake Sullivan, and others of their ilk. I mean, they didn't know anything about the real world. They were educated at the best schools, but they only learned that the U.S. is exceptional, it's indispensable, and it can exert its will throughout the world. And that may have been the case after the war, World War II. That may have been the case after the Soviet Union fell apart, as it was to an extent. It ain't the case anymore. We are in real danger. And if I were Putin, I'd be looking at all this, or Xi Jinping, and say, my God, do they really want to take us both on at the same time? So I think they'll keep their powder dry, but I really fear for the lack of experience and the lack of wisdom on the part of all these people who have Biden's ear.
there seems to be a concern about and I say this as a 32-year-old with a biology degree, so I understand the absurdity of me trying to look at, you know, CENTCOM and the Pentagon top down. I get it, but it's my podcast, so I can do whatever I want. There seems to be some concern about the number of Javelin and Stinger missiles, the APCs, the MRAPs, the Carl Gustav recoilless rifles, everything we're sending to Ukraine. And the conspiratorial side minded me says it looks like you're weakening the U.S. arsenal. It looks like you're draining it. Another part of my mind says this is just the chugging along of the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us of on January 17th, 1961. And as soon as we get out of Afghanistan, well, of course, they need a new thing to start cranking the money wheel on. That's not good, but it's kind of the devil you know. It's like, yeah, what did you think? That the war was going to stop? Of course not. Another part of me has to maybe not completely write myself off and go, okay, although I'm not a military expert, I'm still 32 years old with some level of experience in my life. What does it look like? Just face value. It looks like we are using Ukraine to bleed Russia, much like we did with the Mujahideen in the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, and perhaps are laying the groundwork for us to do this in Taiwan, and are also quote unquote practicing what we preach, and thus can turn around in a month or a year and tell all the NATO countries they need to dial up the spending. And I'm not defending or opposing any of this. I'm just what it seems like it is, and that will push a hurting Russia further into the bosom of China. Nobody wants nuclear war. Nobody makes money on that. But it almost seems to be that the powers that be, for whatever reason, are pushing us towards a just short of a hot war, but perhaps a cold war with a new boogeyman being a Russo Sino alliance with the United States, and then the good old days of Cold War NATO. And that's not, I mean, I don't think it's conspiratorial because we've seen for decades, and again, as warned by a sitting president and warned 30 years prior to that by General Smedley Butler, there's a lot of money in this game, right? It's not just power and nationalism. That's a part. There's a lot of money to be printed. You gotta have new B-21 Raiders. You gotta have new Zumwalt class destroyers. We need no new Ohio class whatever. Space Force needs a budget. We need That's kind of what it looks like. I don't give any weight to we're stumbling towards nuclear war simply because, well, I don't know. We got through the Cuban Missile Crisis and we're not there yet. So when we get there, I'll be worried, but we're not there yet. And again, there's no money in nuclear war. They want the people in China, the people in Beijing and Moscow are the same people in London and New York, and that they want in DC. They want the game to keep going, right? You want to rig the game. You want the monopoly board to be one-sided, but nobody wants to flip the monopoly board because the game's over, right? They like their penthouses too. They like their Rolls Royces. They like going to Davos. They like the state visits. But it seems like 100,000 foot view, regardless of Trump, regardless of Biden, it seems like that's what we're going towards is us and NATO. And it's now we've moved the Overton window to we're okay with sending arms to Ukraine. We've done it several times now. The next step is going to be a package to Taiwan, which I think we just did, and another package and another package, and then demanding that the rest of the NATO countries help us because America can't do it alone. Do you think there's any
Tom,
evidence to that, or do I need to lay off the reefer? I don't even smoke. I don't know why I use that analogy, but
Tom, there are benefits to having majored in biology. It's the real world. Okay. They forced me to take a classics major biology, and I learned a hell of a lot because DNA had just been discovered, and the professor was out of his gourd. He was one of the discoverers. Okay.
Francis and Crick.
Yeah. No,
Mhm.
this was a professor in Fordham at New York. Anyhow, I learned a hell of a lot, and it sort of put my feet on the ground. Now, you mentioned Cuba. Now, let's take Cuba. This is the last time that the flag has gone up so high, so to speak. This is the last time the threat has become so acute. What happened? Well, uh, the intelligence agencies of the US government told John Kennedy, Khrushchev would never dare try to put offensive strategic missiles in Cuba. Nah, he'd know. Khrushchev would know that there would stop that, so he wouldn't even try it. And so, September, October of 1962, these big ships landed in Cuba and deployed medium range strategic missiles with nuclear capability. Now, we jumped all around because we discovered them. U-2s flying over Cuba. Wow, we discovered them. Yeah, but we didn't give Kennedy much warning. Okay, so Kennedy says to us, "Okay, so they did. They sent them, right? And they're there. Are they armed? Do they have nuclear tips on them?" And we said, photography is not that good. We don't have any other sources, but no, we don't think so. We assess that they're not on the alert. They don't have nuclear weapons mounted on them. Guess what, Tom? We were wrong. They were armed.
Yeah.
And we didn't learn that for 3 decades. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's the perspective I'd like your watchers or listeners to put on this. So here we are in October of 1962. McGovern has just finished his graduate studies and is reporting to Fort Benning, Georgia, to attend the infantry officers orientation course, where we'll practice with all the new weaponry. We'll be all, we'll learn how to lead these platoons. And okay, it was right just before Vietnam started to really go wild. So we arrived there. My reporting date was November 3, 1962. And guess what? There weren't any weapons there. A lot of us, we heard about this, rocket launcher. My God, a rocket launcher from, like a rifle. Where are they? There wasn't any. Where the 105 howitzers? There aren't any. 155? No, they don't. Where are they? We finally got a sergeant to tell us, look, 2 divisions came through here 2 weeks ago. They're all in Key West. They're ready to go to Cuba. Now, here's a kind of a personal reflection on how close we were to nuclear war. Those weapons were not at the infantry training center. They were ready for war, okay? Now, what did President Kennedy do? He said, this is an existential threat to the United States. I threaten nuclear war if you don't get those things out of there. Whoa. Now, was that out of the order? I mean, was it existential threat? What does a president do? Does he threaten war? Whoa! Nobody criticized Kennedy for threatening war, a nuclear war, as a matter of fact, because he was, guess what? Provoked.
Yeah.
Remember that word,
Yeah.
provoked. Okay. Luckily, there were some sensible people, including former ambassador to the Soviet Union, Llewellyn Thompson, whom, to his credit, Kennedy insisted be at all these meetings so he could face down these super generals who wanted to do in Castro and kill about 50 million people in Russia to get rid of those commies was a for all, right? So they worked it out. How did they work it out? They made a compromise. The compromise, we withdrew missiles from Turkey, and Khrushchev could tell his folk that that was the quid pro quo, and he pulled the missiles out of Cuba. So recapitulating, existential threat, right? Threat of actual war in reaction to this, provocation, and then working it out. I'm sure Khrushchev had taken the measure of Kennedy when they met in Vienna a couple of months before. So, this guy could be had, Well, he couldn't be had, and Khrushchev backed off. Now, existential threat. Now, how does that relate to Ukraine? Well, Putin regards what NATO had been doing in Central Europe, including installing missile bases in Romania, Poland, and perhaps in Ukraine, as an existential threat. He tried to kind of work things out at the turn of last year. It didn't work, and I can give you some particulars on that nobody ever mentions. It didn't work. He got some backing from China. He said, okay, sorry, this is an existential threat. They have provoked me. They won't listen to negotiations. I'm going to clean them out. And that's what he did. So everybody says, oh, it was terrible. The invasion was illegal and unprovoked. Now, I'm not a lawyer. There's a reasonable argument that under the UN treaty, this may not have been illegal. I'm not going to argue that. What I am going to say is to say this was unprovoked is ludicrous. You have to know nothing about what the U.S. had done since the fall of the Soviet Union to believe that. It was provoked right up. It was provoked, right? So what does that mean? Well, you can have it both ways, It's an existential threat. And if Putin, as I think he is concerned first and foremost in preventing his country from being obliterated or cajoled or pressured or invaded as they had been by the French and the Germans and the Swedes and the Finns and the Poles and everybody's brother,
Forever.
okay? Not to speak of the Mongolian hordes for 2 centuries, okay?
Yeah.
So I think he wants to defend his country. And he reasons that after watching the U.S. behavior and really not getting the assurance that he wanted from Biden, and also not feeling that Biden is fully in charge, he decided to clean it out. Now, it's awful what's happening, but it can stop as soon as some reasonable assurance is given to Putin that Russian strategic interests and Russia's existential threat, the threat to Russia, can be negotiated away. So what I'm saying is that when you mentioned Cuba, it's a really good analogy because it is an existential threat on both sides, Cuba and on Ukraine. Iraq? Tell me what the existential threat was to us. I mean, so we could leave Iraq or sort of leave Iraq, or yes, we leave Iraq, but nothing happens because Iraq was not a threat to us. Neither was Afghanistan, neither was Libya, neither Somalia. They're not any threat to us. So the valid analogy is Cuba and Ukraine. And I think that we can make that understandable by the American people, but we can't get any print, we can't get any airtime. That's the real problem. That's why I'm happy to talk to folks like you, Tom, so that we get the word out.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you coming on here. I mean, I've gotten banned from YouTube and iTunes for, COVID misinformation, so it's nothing holding me back. Might as well go down the rabbit hole. And I think that's correct. That's how you look. That can be how you look at Iraq. You can look at Vietnam. There wasn't that even Korea. There wasn't that existential terror, right? maybe Korea because it was so soon after World War II. I don't know. Maybe there's still lingering echoes of, I don't know, a world at war. But when you look at it that way, in terms of Russia defending their own interests, yeah, it's kind of that moment where you realize, like, hey, maybe we're not always the good guys. And I don't want to spiral off into some, self-hatred thing, because I don't think that's the answer either, to think that you and your country and your race are the bane of humanity. But on the other hand, like, you do kind of have to look at it and go, are we surrounding? We are, right? I mean, Base Nation, a great book by Professor David Vine, details our bases around the world. And it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of funny because when you see, myself included, all the criticism of the Belt and Road Initiative by China, it's almost like George Carlin when he was like, he's like, we bomb brown people. We never bomb white people. When's the last white people we've bombed? The Germans. And that's only because they said, we're going to take over the world. Bullshit. That's our
That's
job.
our job.
That's our job. That's our fucking job. It's kind of funny when you look at Belt and Road Initiative, you're like, we got to stop this. They're trying to put bases around the world using economically disparaged nations to allow us to put warm water ports. That's our job. Like, right? But so at a moment though, you
Oh,
have to
you're
kind of,
right. Yeah.
yeah, you have to look at it and go, but like, all Carlin jokes aside, you go, well, then can we criticize them if they start acting in a way to defend themselves?
Yeah, I would suggest along these lines that your audience get a hold of that famous map that was going around about 2 years ago, showing all the bases surrounding Russia and surrounding China. And the caption is something like, why did Russia and China put their countries right
So
in the
close to
middle
our
of our
bases.
military bases? Now, on a more serious note, Tom, you mentioned Korea. Um, I'm old enough, so I had a lot of experience with Korea, with the older brothers of my friends coming back dead,
Mm-hmm.
coming back injured. Lots of them. Awful, awful war. Now, need it have been so? No.
Yeah.
Zhou Enlai, who was one of the Chinese leaders, warned us, warned MacArthur and all of them, said, look, uh, if you go beyond 38th parallel, we're going to come in. You're going to have to deal with us. And the US military said, China, what do they got? They just got a lot of people. We'll just bomb the hell out of them. And if necessary, we'll use nukes on them, right?
Yeah,
Well,
MacArthur.
you know the rest of the story, right? So
Yeah.
that thing dragged on for years, thousands and thousands killed unnecessarily, Chinese as well as Americans, of course. A godforsaken war that need not have happened. And when it did happen, at least we should have at least listened to Zhou Enlai. He told us this. We didn't have direct relations. He told us this to the Indian ambassador, and that was the channel we used in those days. It was real. And of course, we went above the 38th parallel, and the Chinese came in en masse. And when I was training with machine guns in ROTC, we had these NCOs, these sergeants that came back from Korea, and they were saying, "Well, you're supposed to calibrate it this way, but if you have 100 Chinese coming up the hill, you're just going." I mean, manpower? Yeah, they got manpower. Now they've got 1 billion.4 man and woman power, and a very sophisticated arms industry. And as I say, they're in virtual alliance with Russia.
At what point then right, and as not to fall into the intoxicating we're the good guys rhetoric, because I mean, who doesn't, feels good? You want to be the good guys. But like I said earlier, I'm also not going to take the stance of we're entirely the bad guys. At a certain point, do you have to hark back to JFK in defending freedom at a certain point? And I know this sounds like some propaganda, but at a certain, and I probably naive as well, but at a certain point, is there an obligation that when you're looking at, I mean, less so Russia, but I mean, China, a police state with concentration camps, you have to start to look at it and go, is there an obligation to contain that? We can wash our hands and go, no more foreign wars. But if China grows and grows and grows and starts imposing its will on the world, is there an obligation as for now, the existing military hegemon, is there an obligation to contain that? And I know a bunch of neocon and Pentagon officials are licking their lips going, yeah, tell them there's an obligation. We need a trillion. I get it. But
Mhm.
just because it makes defense contractors money doesn't necessarily mean that I'm incorrect. Is there an and sure that can that rationale probably still has a sour taste in people's mouth, right? We got to go liberate the people of Iraq. We got to go we'll tell that to all the soldiers who were maimed and killed. Tell that to the 1.5 million civilians. But
Yeah, that didn't have anything to do with liberating Iraq. I mean, let's
I
face
know,
it.
I know, I know.
Yeah.
I'm not buying into it. That being said, if we do nothing, maybe they move on Taiwan, maybe Russia moves on Ukraine, and then maybe it stops there. Who knows? I don't know that. I don't have a crystal ball. Maybe it does.
Well, let's look at Chinese history. I mean, I think there are 5 millennia you
Yeah.
could look at.
Yeah.
All right. So it's a little rich in history. Uh, have they attacked other countries? Well, no, there are many of them. They had trouble ruling themselves and getting their own country together, for God's sake. Have they been attacked? They sure have. Have they been deprived of some of the lands that rightfully belong to them? Well, yes, they have. By whom? Russia? Would you believe that in the 7th century, some Cossack named Yermak went out to Siberia, stuck a Russian flag in the ice, and said, "This is Russia." They completed what the Chinese call unequal treaties. Nerchinsk, for example, where uh, 1.5 square kilometers of Siberia were given to Russia because this fellow stuck. I mean, that's a little bit exaggerated, but not by much. How about Japan? Well, the Chinese have a very serious problem with Japan. And with the century of humiliation at the hands of the British imperial forces there, they used to sail up the rivers. I mean, China has a very rich history, but it's a very bitter one with respect to people trying to exploit China, and it's very meager. There's one time when I think about 2 millennia ago, the Chinese did uh, did lash out against against the Vietnamese. Okay, but that is a complicated sort of thing. Historians are not in agreement with who is really the aggressor in that. But up till now, I mean, Xi Jinping has his hands full. Now, one has to be really careful at what one believes when we hear about all that terrible concentration camp stuff in Xinjiang. Uh, I don't know. I don't trust anyone, but I certainly don't believe that the same people who let Yemen be decapitated, that let children and everybody else die in Yemen, uh, because we facilitate Saudi air bombing and
Uh-huh.
rocketing, that those people really care very much about Xinjiang and what
Mm.
happens there. So I think we have a lot of hypocrisy here. I think the Chinese and the Russians see this for what it is. It's a cudgel to beat them. And in the more enlightened days, when people like Schultz was running our foreign policy, He used to make the representations to his opposite number, Shevardnadze, for example, in the Kremlin, and he'd say, "Now I have to start out by saying we would really like you to be able to let more Jewish people emigrate to Israel, and we're afraid that you might be not being you're being too tight in your restrictions on these people." And Shevardnadze would look and he'd say, "Thank you. I'm glad. We'll look into that. I'll take a note of that. Now let's get down to the real critical questions." And they dealt. And we got arms control treaties. We got a strategic arms control treaty. We got a intermediate forces arms control treaty. The first was left by Bush, Cheney, and John Bolton, 2002. The next one, the all-important medium forces in Europe and Russian part of the European part of Russia. Trump got out of that 2019. Now, those were the cornerstone for stability. And if you're Russian, you'll say you're Putin. You say, "Well, why'd you do that? What'd you have in mind?" Yeah, I mean, hello. And our response was very diplomatic. None of your damn business. We do what we want. We're the sole superpower. Actually, we're the only exceptional country in the world. So we just do these things. Now, just a little side note here. When I lecture at colleges, we talk about these things, and I say, "Well, now, of course, you know that the U.S. is the exceptional nation." And most of them kind of say, "Oh, yeah, sure, that's what we're taught." And I said, "Well, now, what's the, do you guys know about synonyms?" "Oh, yeah, those are like words." "How about antonyms?" And one or two of them will know enough grammar. So, "Oh, yeah, that's an opposite word." I said, "Okay, well, what's the antonym to exceptionalism?" Huh.
Average.
Non-exceptional, expendable, yeah. Non-exceptional, yeah. So yeah, not indispensable, indispensable, not indispensable. So all the other countries are dispensable. That's how all the other countries look at the United States now. And for good or ill, the US doesn't have the military power behind it to enforce what we would like to see the rest of the world do. So when we talk about these really core issues, they're the ones that control. And I'm afraid that as far as Russian history is concerned, if you look over the grand scheme of things, as I have, as I was required to do way back 6 decades ago, you see a country that emerged 900 AD, I mean, 900 years in the new era, okay? Didn't have a language. One was constructed for them, a written language, I should say. They had a very, very fertile oral language. They had epic poetry, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. One was called Slovo a Polku Igorevyu. It's a beautiful thing, but they had no way to write it down, okay? So these two priests from Greece go up there and they construct an alphabet for the Slavs, okay? If there was a Greek letter, they used that, or Latin letter, they knew Latin. They knew Hebrew, a little bit of Hebrew, and there was some sounds, ja, for example, that they had to construct a letter for, right? Well, that was 900, 1000, okay? So when you talk about comparing that with a Chinese civilization or Persians or Egyptian, I mean, it's quite a difference. So they get started, and what happens? The Mongols come in from Asia, 1200. They come in en masse. Genghis Khan, all his folks, and they stay from 1200 to 1420. Okay, 14. What's that? It's 2 centuries and 20 years. Now, what was happening in the West? Well, we were finally getting out of the Dark Ages, actually coming into the Renaissance. Well, the Russians are just getting rid of these guys, and then the Russians got got their act together, and ironically, the guy we call Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, he got his house of cards together, and you had Muscovy. You had a semi-united country speaking Russian, and what happened then? The Swedes, the Hanseatic League, the Finns, the Lithuanians, the Poles, for 2 centuries. They're invaded from the West now, okay? So Peter the Great comes into power around 1700. Now, he was really a unique guy because even before he was formally czar, he traveled in the West. He spent 2 years working on the wharves in Rotterdam. He found out how the West orders itself. And he went back and he was convinced our future, we as Russians, our future lies in the West. So what did he do? He Westernized things. What did he mean? Well, the best thing is to cite Alexander Pushkin, the greatest Russian poet, wrote about how Peter the Great looked out over the Baltic Sea and he said, "Отнюдь грозит мы будем шведу, здесь будет город заложен, назло нам бедному соседу, природа здесь нам суждено в Европу прорубить окно." Okay, so what does that mean?
Yeah,
It
what does
means
that mean?
from here we look out and we see the hated Swedes. Shvedu, okay? That meant Swedes, it meant Finns, it meant people from the Nordic areas, okay? From here we're gonna threaten those guys and we're gonna prorubit. That means rubit is to cut. Prorubit is cut through a window, akno, Evropu, a window to Europe. Now, the rest of that century was spent with Catherine the Great coming in. They expanded Russia down to and including Crimea. Okay, they got a warm water port for once, and they were off and running. Okay, what happens? Napoleon invades. Where? Well, up to Moscow and a little bit toward Ukraine. What happens after that? Hitler invades. This time, big time into Ukraine. Okay, so that's Russian history, folks. How many Russians died in World War II?
A
You know,
20-something million.
26 million. Well, most people say 27 million. It's 26.6 is the accurate figure. Putin doesn't exaggerate. He says 26 million. Okay. How many Americans died in World War II?
415,000.
That's right. Yeah, 424,000 is what the count is. Last time I checked. Okay, so there's a little disparity there.
Yeah,
There's a little recognition that the Russians know what war is like.
sure.
Every single Russian family was affected by World War II. And the irony is that most people think that they might not have been able to win were it not for the help they got from us, from Lend-Lease, from all these trucks, from all these tanks and all these airplanes and stuff. And I had an incredible experience in Moscow about 7 years ago. I spoke there, and it was the anniversary of the meeting on the Elbe, where Russian forces for the first time in April of 1945 joined with U.S. forces 3 weeks before Berlin was fell. Okay, so we were celebrating that. I recited a poem that I had learned about Russian grief for all the casualties that had occurred. And then a 6'5", 91-year-old Russian general comes up to me. So I look up and he says, "Mr. McGovern." I said, "Yeah, da." He says, "Studebaker, Studebaker, Studebaker." Now, for you younger set, Studebaker used to make a whole bunch of cars, okay? And Franklin Roosevelt said, "You're not going to make any more cars. You're going to make tanks. You're going to make planes. You're going to make armored vehicles for Russia. You're going to send them to Iran. They're going to get in there and going to beat the Nazis. which they did. Okay. So here is a frontline infantry general who fought on the Western Front, I learned later, saying to me, an American, Studebaker, 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 which helped Russia to knock the Nazis back to the West. It was Russia that won the war. You could tell not only from the casualties, but from the years, for God's sake.
Mm-hmm.
So Americans don't know that. They really should know that. And there's really no innate hostility that should exist between the Russian and the American people. Only that remains is instilled by false propaganda, mostly on our side. Witness, and this is important, witness 5 years of claiming that the Russians interfered in the 2016 Russiagate, 2016 election, which is disproven now by the very people who are claiming it. But guess what? You ask your friends. They still believe in Russiagate. They still believe that the Russians hacked into the DNC, even though the head of the firm looking into that, the cyber firm, says, no evidence. We don't have any evidence. Last thing here, I'll cite something that's become one of my favorite things. It's the Rudy Giuliani dictum. Do you know what that is?
I do not.
Yeah, okay. Well, during the January 6 hearings, it became clear from people in Arizona, the legislators there, that Rudy Giuliani called up the head of the legislature there in Arizona and said, look, election irregularities, falsification, all kinds of damage being done. You got to look into it. And so the head of the legislature there says, oh my God, well, what's the evidence? And here's the Rudy Giuliani dictum. Well, there are lots of theories, but no evidence. Lots of theories, but no evidence. I mean, that's what he said to these guys. So that's what people deal with here. When President Biden himself says, we have to stop Putin in Ukraine because he has larger ambitions. It's a nice theory.
Lots of theories.
It certainly sells a lot of weapons. But where's the evidence?
Yeah.
There is absolutely no evidence that Putin had it in his head to seize Crimea before the coup on the 22nd of February, 2014, which was the most blatant coup in history because it was advertised 2 weeks beforehand on YouTube.
I remember watching streams of that on ustream.com. Me and my older brother we'd stay up all night because the time difference, because I remember we were like, how absurd is this? We are watching in live time a coup. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we had 2.5 weeks to prepare for it because I have to confess, I was surprised. I thought, well, wait a second, that coup is blown. I mean, you had this intercepted conversation between the Assistant Secretary of State and our ambassador in Kiev talking about not only a coup, but who was going to come into the government. Too bad for those guys. Poor Yatsenyuk, he was going to be premier. Too bad. I wonder what he's got to do now. Well, that's probably what Putin thought, because he stayed in Sochi at the Winter Olympics. Didn't come back until the day after the coup in Ukraine. Now, what did the Washington Post do with that? Here's the story. On February 23rd, Putin arranged a secret meeting of his chief military advisors and decided to seize Crimea. I wrote a letter to the Washington Post. Don't you think you should have mentioned the coup the previous day? They published it. Yeah, but actually they published my letter. But that's small. That's probably the last time I'll get into the Washington Post anytime soon. So yeah, there's a lot to be. What I'd encourage people, people who really are searching for the truth, to get out there and tell their friends, you're being had. And, this could end up not only with Ukrainian body bags, but German and French, and God forbid, US body bags. It could really escalate because the people in power this time around are not as wise, they're not as conscious of the dangers as the people around John Kennedy. And John Kennedy, as you know, was so impacted by how close the world came to calamity that it was then that he turned to negotiate limited test ban treaties and
Mm-hmm.
withdraw troops from Vietnam. And of course, as a result, they killed him.
Of course, 100%. He tried to slow down the machine.
We can't have that. Yeah. So, but there are enough of us. We have to. People say, "Don't you get?" I'll tell you one more thing. People say, "Don't you get tired, Ray?" I mean, for God's sake, you're going to retire, and then you're doing this stuff for 20 years. Don't you get tired? And I told them that, look, I remember a good friend of mine. You're probably too young to remember him, but his name was Dave Obey, and he was a leading representative from Wisconsin. Okay. He became the head of the House Appropriations Committee at a very difficult time and had to appropriate stuff for Iraq and for Afghanistan, very much against his will. And then he left. Okay. But before that, back in the 80s, when the Reagan administration was playing fast and loose with Iran and with Contras and all that stuff. And the Iran Contra controversy, where, make a long story short, we were selling arms to Iran, and the money was going to the Contras fighting the duly elected representatives in Nicaragua. At the end of that, it went on for 3 years, and Bush was called by my friend Dave Obey, representative from Wisconsin, chair of this subcommittee at the time. And he says, so, Mr. Schultz, we want to talk about Iran-Contra and how your administration did not inform my committee of the liberties you were taking with the law on exporting weapons. And Schultz is a good guy. He was the best of them, but he made this big mistake. He looked at Dave Obey and said, "Mr. Obey, the country is tired of Iran-Contra." And here's what I always remember. Obey looked down at Schultz and he said, "Mr. Schultz, I didn't swear to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic, until I got tired." Well, most of your audience is younger than me. I'm going to keep doing this, and I'm not going to get tired. I may not be able to do it all that much longer, but I'm going to do it until I get too tired to do it. So you guys who are younger and less tired or less likely to get tired, it's really up to you to speak out and make sure Americans are given a decent chance to find out what the truth is on these things. Because, we just can't stop doing it. And the other folks that I like to let's see. Yeah. Well, there was a publicist, a terrific guy. What was his name? We'll let that one go.
The less eloquently than you said it, but the comedian Tim Dillon, probably the most vulgar person alive, but I think he's the funniest person alive. He's also wildly intelligent, and he had a good line that I always think of and try to lean back towards, and it's to not define yourself as left or right. Don't say I'm Democrat or I'm Republican, because what that allows you to do is say, I see the world through this lens, and that's it. And that is the shirking of the responsibility of independent critical thought. So I try to do that instead of, looking at Ukraine through this is Biden or this is Trump. Just look at what's going on. Don't look at it as, was it Obama's drone war or Bush's drone war? Look at, was the evidence for the WMDs cooked? Who's benefiting from this? To not look at things through whose side does this benefit, but just like Truman wanted, untreated intelligence. I try to do that more and more and go, what is the untreated? What is really going on? And yeah, it brings you to some unsettling truths. It makes you realize that we're not always the good guy. It makes you realize that maybe the bad guys aren't as evil. But ultimately, again, back to the CIA, the truth does set you free. When you come to peace with it, it's liberating. And you go, just like we want to defend our country, what a surprise. Other countries probably want to defend themselves. And when we look back at Vietnam, or you look back at Korea, you look back at Vietnam, you look back at GWAT, yeah, I mean, the pattern is there. That something happens, we kind of just bum rush through it, or go along to get along, and then 20 years later, we go, what a tragedy. Well, if it keeps happening, you have to start looking around and go, wait a second. Are we going to be looking back at this in 2040 and going, how did they not see that X, Y, and Z was happening again? I think that's what we have to do. And that doesn't even require being tired. It requires a certain amount of vulnerability and lowering your ego and just trying to look at it, trying to look at things soberly and examine them just as what's going on, like biology. You don't have a political opinion on biology. You're just looking at the microscope. It's just what is. That is what I think is probably the single best thing anyone can do, is just try to have a sober examination of reality and not remove the obligation of independent critical thought, which is difficult. It's so much easier to say, what's the Republican standpoint? That's mine. Or what's the Democrat standpoint? That's mine. No, you got to remove it. You even got to remove the flag. You got to go, what's going on? And I think that's really all we can do. At least that's all I can do.
Well, I think that's right, Tom. And as for getting tired, it's a struggle that we might not see the end of. At least
Sure.
I might not see the end of. I.F. Stone, yeah, that's the fellow I was trying to remember. I.F. Stone had this wonderful way of putting it. He says, "Look, if you're struggling for justice and truth, you're going to lose, but then you're going to lose again. Then you're going to lose again, but then one fine day, people who think the same as you do, people equally devoted to justice and truth, are going to win. Okay, I mean, you may not live to see that day, but it's going to come. Okay, so meanwhile, what we got to do is not get all wrapped up around ourselves, even try to keep a modicum of a sense of humor,
Mm,
but realize that this is a little bigger than you, that we keep trying, and one day the good guys are going to win.
yeah. The first they laugh at you, then they mock you, then they attack you, then they ask you how you did it, and then they build statues to you. Right? That's how, which maybe isn't the best justification. You shouldn't be doing it for your ego, but just hold the line. Do what you know is right.
Yeah.
And yeah, you might not see, that's the other thing. You might not see the fruits of your labor. You might not see a better world in your life. It doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for.
Amen. Tom, if we're nearing the end of this, I want to
Sure.
make sure that my youngest son doesn't beat me up. He runs my website,
Okay.
And he has told me on occasion, Dad, I watched your interview. You didn't mention the
Gotta
website.
plug the website.
Look, Dad, you tell him the website, and then you tell him if you don't get it, you don't get it. So I'm far too humble to say the latter, but I will say that our website is raymcgovern.com. Real easy to remember, raymcgovern.com.
RAYMCGOVERN for anybody
You
listening.
got it.
Am I correct?
Mhm.
And I will
That's
put
it.
that in. I will put that in the description as well. So go click on
Okay, good.
raymcgovern.com.
I'll tell my son.
Absolutely beautiful. And don't let him beat you up. If he starts beating you up, give me a call. I wouldn't let that happen.
Well,
All right. I'll come throw some fists.
yeah,
Mr. McGovern, thank you so much for your time, sir. Love to have you back on again as always. And yeah, you might be tired, but yeah, it's worth fighting for. It's worth it.
mhm.
It's a good thing to be tired for. You're gonna get tired anyway. Might as well get something out of it.
Yeah. Actually, I find a little ale or beer in the evening is a good way to celebrate your tiredness.
Oh,
Also helps
absolutely.
you go to sleep.
Absolutely. It's yeah, nothing wrong with rewarding yourself for a good hard fight, right? Nothing hard with that. I mean, hell, FDR was drinking and smoking cigarettes every day. He didn't let a little bit of world war get in his way. Still had a good time, right? Right. And granted, he died, but we all do. But with that, Mr. McGovern, I'll
Okay.
send you this episode when it's up. It'll be up later this evening, and I look forward to chatting with you again, man.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Thank you so much. God